Right now, I want to take you out to this live look over a very snowy White House at this hour, as in just a matter of hours, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is expected to meet with President Trump at the White House as tensions continue to grow between the U.S. and Iran. The two leaders have met at least 7 times since Trump's second term began last January, and the White House says President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu are set to meet at 11 a.m. Eastern time, so we're talking about 2.5 hours from now. It's not clear if members of the media will be allowed in either before or after, and if there is any kind of joint press conference, we'll make sure to bring it to you, as you can watch it here, as always, on Live Now from Fox. Want to pop this up on your screen? This is actually from the Prime Minister's social media account, as he posted that photo on the left-hand side of your screen saying Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu met with the special envoys of the U.S. President Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. The PM and envoys Witkoff and Kushner discussed regional issues, and they provided an update on the first round of negotiations that they held with Iran just last Friday. Now, later on, just about 30 minutes from now, we expect that Netanyahu will meet with Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and then, as I mentioned, 11 a.m. Eastern time, he is set to speak with President Trump. I want to bring in Ben Cohen, senior analyst at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, directing its Rapid Response Outreach program, joining us now live to talk about what to expect from this meeting here. Ben, thank you so much for being here with us this morning.
Good morning, Josh.
And of course, the big question I want to start off with here is kind of an overall look at this meeting itself. What is the ultimate goal of the meeting between Netanyahu and Trump? What are each hoping to get out of this?
Well, I think most immediately, the goal is to get them on the same page on both Iran and on the reconstruction of Gaza. And those are two key, I would say, existential questions for Israel. In the case of Iran, Iran remains absolutely Israel's deadliest enemy in the region, openly committed to Israel's destruction, and of course, over several years, backing many of these proxies that have attacked Israel and subjected Israel to terrorism: Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, various militias in Iraq. So there's no ambiguity about Iran's intentions towards the state of Israel. And I think where Netanyahu and the broader political and military leadership in Israel will be concerned right now is that over the last 2.5 years, since the war in Gaza, triggered by the Hamas massacre on October the 7th, 2023, Iran has been very badly damaged. It was subjected to 12 days of sustained airstrikes by both Israel and the US last year. We saw various events over the last 2 years, quite spectacular events in the case of Hezbollah, where the proxies were attacked very decisively and weakened. And so I think despite all the suffering that war has generated, Israel did come out of it with some successes. And I think they're going to be concerned that a negotiating process with Iran is going to reverse that outcome, strengthen the regime, which today, of course, is marking 47 years of being in power, a black day, certainly for the Iranian people. And so I think really that any tension in these discussions between Trump and Netanyahu will revolve around the threat level that Iran presents to Israel, and how these current talks between the US and Iran address that threat level.
Is there anything to read into with the fact that Prime Minister Netanyahu moved up his trip? Because the trip to meet with President Trump was actually set to happen sometime next week, but it's now been moved up to today. So is there anything to take away from that at all?
Well, look, I think there is obviously a great deal of time urgency anytime you're dealing with Iran. And Netanyahu's trip here is coming off the back of several weeks of protest, civilian protest in Iran. Some estimates that 36,000 demonstrators were slaughtered by the regime during that time. I've even seen claims of 90,000, but we're certainly talking about several massacres of Iranian civilians over several days. And that led the US to deploy an aircraft carrier in the Gulf. The Abraham Lincoln is there. Trump is reportedly thinking about deploying a second aircraft carrier there. Trump's rhetoric at the height of the protests was very much designed to bolster the protesters. He was saying things like, "We're locked and loaded." He was making promises to the Iranian people, we're coming to help you. And now that has come off the boil to a certain degree, but the pressure is there. The military pressure is there. And Trump has also said on more than one occasion in the last few days that his advice to the Iranians would be to make this deal. I think one of the reasons why Netanyahu would want to push his encounter with Trump up the calendar is because it's not clear exactly what is being discussed with Iran. But if the Iranian version of events is anything to go by, then all that's being discussed is the nuclear program, the issue of Iran's ballistic missile program, its support for the terrorist proxies, and of course its internal repression of its people. Those are, again, according to the Iranian side, off the agenda. And so I think that Netanyahu is worried that what we're going to have at the end here is a kind of a repeat of the 2015 nuclear deal, which didn't dismantle Iran's nuclear infrastructure and critically allowed Iran to carry on enriching uranium.
Kind of expanding on that overall, what are maybe some of the overall differences that the U.S. has in its goals for what they expect from Iran versus maybe what Israel wants? So President Trump versus what Prime Minister Netanyahu wants out of all of this.
Well, look, I think that we're dealing here with an American administration that is not averse to occasional military action, but doesn't want to get involved in sustained military campaigns. And so when you take that stance, obviously negotiations become attractive. And if the person or the entity that you're negotiating with is weak at that time, as Iran certainly is now, then the idea of negotiating becomes even more attractive. I think, look, the issue that is going to be concerning the Israelis is, in some ways, it's the same in Gaza and Iran. That's the issue of verification. If Iran is to end its nuclear ambitions, then it's not good enough to just simply have a commitment from the Iranians to do that, assuming you can even get one. You need to actually verify the various steps in the process towards denuclearization. I think you're dealing, funny enough, with something similar in Gaza, where the talk is of Hamas disarming. But again, that disarmament needs to be verified. So I think the Israelis are going to be approaching this by saying, don't trust, verify. And I think they're going to want to see a lot more detail from the administration, both on its intentions with Iran and also how it sees this Gaza reconstruction process unfolding, before it's willing to give its blessing to these talks.
Talking about the region as a whole, the Middle East, what kind of, I guess, goals are they hoping for? How could this impact the entire region based on not just what happens during the talks today between President Trump and Netanyahu, but really the Iran situation in general? How does that impact the region as a whole?
Well, look, Iran has a very profound impact on the region as a whole. Its meddling in Yemen has resulted in a terrible civil war with a terrible humanitarian crisis. Equally in Iraq, and this is certainly an issue of concern currently to the administration. In Iraq, Iran still controls a number of militias. It also, of course, still has its relationship with Hezbollah in Lebanon. Hezbollah, of course, much chastened since the war with Israel over the last 2 years, but still a force in Lebanon. And by the way, in Lebanon, one of the key tasks is securing Hezbollah's disarmament, and that hasn't happened either. So Iran has these fingers in various pies across the region, and it still causes a huge amount of uncertainty and instability. It's very clear that Israel would like to see a change of regime in Iran. It's even more clear that the majority of Iranians would also like to see the back of that regime. It's not clear whether this administration sees a set of conditions where that regime could survive. But these negotiations certainly suggest that this administration is willing to consider the idea of a surviving Islamic Republic, so long as it doesn't pose too much of a threat to its neighbors. And that's why, there's this imperative of addressing the ballistic missile program and addressing the support for terror proxies around the region.
And I know we can't kind of see into the future here, and you touched on this a little bit, but do you see, based on your expertise, an end to the Iranian regime anytime in the coming months or even years at this point, based on what we've seen?
I think that Iran is, and I'm saying this on the Islamic Republic's 47th birthday. I think Iran is weaker now than at any time since Khomeini took power in 1979. And I think that we have had a huge opportunity over the last month. Those protests that we saw in January, they didn't come out of a vacuum. Iran has been convulsed with regular waves of protest since 2009. So we're coming on now for 16 years of more and more Iranians rising up against this regime and seeking to overthrow it. So yes, I do think that the collapse of the Iranian regime is an eminently realistic goal to aim for. But I think that also what we've learned in the last 15, 20 years is that can't happen simply through an internal process in Iran. There needs to be aid and assistance from abroad. And I think this is why so many Iranians now are looking to President Trump. And they're asking, is this the President Trump who will negotiate a deal with the Iranians? Or is this the President Trump as portrayed by, for example, Senator Lindsey Graham, who really has the interests of the Iranian people at heart and ultimately will push through a situation where this regime collapses?
And my last question for you here, based on whatever President Trump and the U.S. decide, what they kind of stick with overall, does Israel have to necessarily agree with that? Does Netanyahu have to do whatever Trump says?
I think that in the case of Iran, it's going to be much tougher for Israel's military to take action against Iran if it doesn't have the backing of the US. And of course, if it doesn't have the backing of the US, then the neighboring Arab countries from Jordan through to Saudi Arabia, all of whom discreetly cooperated with the operation last June, they may not do the same again. So I think certainly in the case of Iran, Israel has problems. I think that when it comes to the peace process or the reconstruction process in Gaza, Israel does have a lot more leeway because Israel is still in control militarily of most of the Gaza Strip, and it can control who enters and exits the Gaza Strip. So I think that if Israel puts its foot down and says to Trump, look, we want to see a serious, verifiable disarmament process with Hamas, or else this reconstruction process can't continue, I think they would have probably more success with on the Gaza front than on the Iran front.
Ben Cohen, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Obviously, a lot of ground covered there. Anything we missed that you want to make sure we mention here before I let you go?
Yeah, look, I think, again, what I want to emphasize is that we had, certainly in June last year and in January of this year, we've shown how weak the Iranian regime is. And I think, therefore, we need to be focusing on a package of measures to further weaken that regime. So not just the nuclear program, but also ending the ballistic missile program, ending the support for proxies. I think all of that is critical if we're going to roll back the gains that Iranian-sponsored extremism in the region has made, over the last, well, I would say 47 years.
All right. Ben Cohen there at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us today. We appreciate it.
Good to be with you, Josh.